Did you know that most high school romances barely last more than 3 weeks? Well, Emily, Michael, and Ryan Cooper sure shattered that statistic. They stretched their connection for a whopping 40 years. Emily and Ryan first met when she was a freshman, and he was a year ahead of her. From that moment on, they were practically glued at the hip. Their love felt like one of those fairy tales that somehow managed to stay intact over the decades, untouched by the harshness of reality. Funny enough, I was married to Emily for about 30 of those years. Back then, I thought everything between us was real. Our marriage felt solid, and after our daughter Sarah was born, it seemed like our bond only deepened. Looking back, I'd say I was genuinely happy during those years. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Let me introduce myself. I'm Michael Taylor, and for almost 3 decades, Emily has been my wife. Or at least, she was supposed to be. But as I mentioned earlier, Emily and Ryan had their little high school fling, and well, she gave herself to him first. You know how most high school romances fizzle out? Yeah, not theirs. It was more like they pressed pause. Ryan was a year older, so once he graduated, he set his sights on making some money, convinced he'd marry her when he came back rolling in cash. At least, that's the story my wife loved to tell all the time. Ryan went off to Alaska to work on some pipeline gig with his uncle, and that's where things started to go sideways. He stopped writing her after a while, leaving Emily all alone in her senior year. She dated some guy named Alex, or maybe it was Anderson, but her heart? That was always with Ryan. Even though she waited for him, Ryan stayed quiet. Turns out, he got real comfortable with the whole pipeline life, traveling around and making money, all the while thinking that his sweet Emily was sitting at home, waiting for him to sweep her off her feet when he finally got rich. Except, life doesn't work like that. People move on, and that's exactly what Emily did. She went to college, got her degree, and we met at a party when she was 24. I was a little older, 29 at the time, but we clicked instantly. I fell hard for her, and I really thought she felt the same about me. Our relationship was pretty typical, but there was this one thing that stuck with me. 2 days before our wedding, out of the blue, a letter from Ryan showed up. Talk about timing, right? In it, he practically begged her to meet him, like the guy was trying to make a grand return. Thankfully, Emily's mother stepped in. She told her daughter to move forward with her life and stop wasting her time on that trash, as she called him. I'll admit, there was a moment when I thought Emily might actually cancel the wedding, but she didn't. She went through with it, and we got married. She became Mrs. Emily Taylor. By the time Ryan tried to crawl back into her life, we were already off on our honeymoon. Apparently, his plan B was to join the Marines, and that's exactly what he did. Once we got back home, life settled into its rhythm. Emily was working as a nurse, and I was an insurance adjuster for a big company. Things felt stable, but there was one problem that kept popping up: Ryan. He started texting Emily again, and she didn't hesitate to reply. When I asked her why she even bothered, she got all defensive, saying he was just an old friend who needed some support since he was alone and serving in the Marines. She claimed she was just trying to cheer him up. I can't pretend I didn't know what was going on. I was fully aware that they were writing back and forth, and I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Even her family tried to talk her out of it, but she just kept up the letters. Then one day, we found out Ryan had married someone he met at his station, and that finally put an end to their little pen pal situation, much to my relief. For a while after that, things calmed down. Over the next 3 years, the only thing we got from Ryan was a few Christmas cards, and I thought that was the end of it. During this quiet stretch, our daughter Sarah was born. With her arrival, Emily and I threw ourselves into building a life together. We worked on our home and farm to give Sarah the kind of upbringing we'd always dreamed of. Those were good times. We were in sync, raising our daughter and making a life. But, as is often the case, peace doesn't last. One day, out of nowhere, another letter from Ryan arrived. Emily never mentioned it, but I started noticing we were going through stamps like crazy. It didn't take a genius to figure out that she had started writing to him again. I decided to let it slide. He was out there serving his country, and I figured if they wanted to exchange letters, that was their business. Even if it bothered me, I convinced myself it wasn't worth causing a fight over. After a while, Emily started sharing bits and pieces of what Ryan was up to. He had divorced his first wife and married again. He had seen combat, and earned quite a few medals. She would talk about him with this odd pride, as if she still admired him. I found myself correcting her at one point, reminding her that he wasn't a soldier, but a Marine. She just laughed it off and joked that she'd better be careful not to offend him. It was hard to listen to, honestly, but I kept hoping she'd eventually let go of him for good. But that day never came. Ryan went on to serve 30 years in the Marines, got married and divorced 3 times, and earned enough medals to decorate an entire wall. Meanwhile, I watched him grow more charming in her eyes, while I just got older and more predictable. My only hope was that when he finally got out, he'd settle somewhere far away from us. But life doesn't always give you what you hope for, and now, here we are. Our daughter Sarah has grown up and married a great guy, James Miller. More good news came with the announcement that Sarah and James were expecting their first child. At 60, I was starting to look forward to retirement, counting down to 65 when I could finally relax and enjoy my golden years in peace. Emily still looked stunning, and even after all this time, she could make my heart skip a beat. But little did I know, that sense of peace I had been clinging to was about to be shattered in the worst possible way. It was a Thursday, and when I got home from work, I found Emily all dressed up, looking immaculate. She told me we had dinner reservations at 7. At first, I was confused, mentally flipping through the calendar for any missed birthdays or anniversaries, but came up with nothing. Still, I played along, went to the bedroom to change, and tried to match her level of elegance. Dinner was great, the restaurant packed, but something didn't sit right with me. I had a gut feeling that this wasn't just about the food. As we were finishing our meal, I turned to her and said, "All right, Emily, let's hear it. I'm in a good mood and won't make a scene. One thing about me is that I never lose my temper in public. Working in insurance teaches you to keep a lid on your emotions, and that skill has bled into my personal life over the years." Emily knew that about me. Whenever she had something unpleasant to tell me, she'd always pick a public place to drop the bomb, banking on the fact that I wouldn't make a scene. That night, I could tell from the look on her face that something was off. After 30 years together, you develop a sixth sense about these things. I just knew whatever she was about to say would ruin my night. Sure enough, after some hesitation, she finally spoke. "Mike, I think you should know, Ryan's back." My stomach churned, but I knew it wasn't the food. I stared at her, waiting for more, but Emily just looked at me, measuring her words carefully. The silence stretched, so I broke it. "When you say back, you mean he's back from vacation, right?" She shook her head and quietly said, "No, Mike, not a vacation. He's been discharged from the Marines and he bought a house 2 streets away from us." I felt my pulse quicken. Panic washed over me. "And he's going to live there with his 3rd wife, right?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Emily shook her head again, speaking softly. "No, he's divorced again. This time, he had to give up part of his pension in the settlement." At that moment, I couldn't hold back. I muttered, "Crap, this is too much." A few diners nearby glanced at me, but I didn't care. It wasn't about Ryan losing part of his pension. It was the fact that this man had moved so close to us, and I had to figure out why. My frustration got the better of me, and I asked, "Emily, you haven't met with Ryan, have you?" Her expression gave her away before she even spoke. I didn't need to hear the words to know the answer. "When and how did this happen, Emily?" I pressed, my voice tight with dread. She looked down, almost ashamed, before answering. "He came by yesterday, to tell me we're neighbors now." My heart pounded in my chest. I needed answers, and fast. "Did you sleep with him, Emily?" I asked bluntly, hoping against hope that I was wrong. But her face told me everything. Then she confessed, "I did, Mike. But it's not what you think." I stared at her, my voice low and full of restrained anger. "I believe my wife cheated on me, Emily. Now explain to me how this isn't what I think it is." She had the nerve to say, "I did it because he needed me, Mike. He came to me so lost, struggling with his anxiety or something over the divorce. He needed me, and I couldn't turn him away. I love you, Mike, but I realized I still love Ryan too." And there it was. My wife had slept with Ryan, and his sob story about PTSD and his failed marriage was his way back into her heart and her bed. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice firm, almost icy. All right, Emily. You did it. The damage is done. But we can fix this. We can work through it, reclaim our life. But you can't sleep with him again. Do you understand? She looked at me tearfully, but her response hit like a gut punch. I can't promise that, Mike. I love him, and he needs me more than you do. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But we were in a crowded restaurant, and this wasn't the place for a scene. I signaled for the check, not saying another word. 10 minutes later, we were in the car, heading home in heavy silence. But I couldn't let it drop. Emily, I said, my voice edged with disbelief, how can you be with him when you have a husband? Have you forgotten the vows we made almost 30 years ago? You know, forsaking all others? She broke down then, sobbing openly. Between her tears, she mumbled, I'm sorry, Mike, but he needs me, and I can't stand the thought of losing him or you. I had no idea how to respond. What do you even say to that? I felt a wave of frustration rising in me. So, what do you suggest, Emily? We take turns? He gets you on New Year's, and I get you for Christmas? This is ridiculous. You can't have two men. She stopped crying and looked at me with a strange expression. How about a break, Mike? I was stunned. A break? What are you talking about, Emily? She quickly changed the subject, dodging the question. Remember 18 years ago when you took a year off to get your master's degree? You did what you had to do, and then you came back. Everything was fine, wasn't it? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emily, how can you even compare that? Me getting a degree benefited our family. What you're doing with Ryan only benefits the two of you. By then, we'd pulled into the driveway, and I killed the engine. Emily reached out, gently touching my face, her voice soft, almost pleading. Mike, I missed out on that last year of high school with Ryan. If I had that time with him, we might not be here right now. Please, give me this year with him, and I promise you, I'll come back to you. I'll be the best wife you've ever had. But I need this time. I didn't even know what to feel anymore. Sadness, betrayal, shock. They all crashed down on me at once. The urge to grab Emily by the neck and squeeze until the light left her eyes was overwhelming. But I caught myself, remembering all too well the stories I'd heard about men who snapped in moments like this. Men who let their rage take over and ended up losing their freedom, their homes, their entire lives, all because of a momentary lapse. So, instead, I took a deep breath and said, All right, Emily, if this is really what you want, go ahead. But don't expect me to support it. And let me be perfectly clear, I don't want to see or hear from you for the entire year. Do you understand? And know this, when that year's over, I might not be here waiting for you. I hoped my conditions would make her think twice, maybe make her hesitate. But no, she just smiled, acting like she hadn't even heard me. She kissed me on the cheek, thanked me like I was doing her a favor, and promised I wouldn't regret it. I shook my head, unable to stop myself from muttering, I already do. That night, she wanted to be close, but I couldn't. The thought of her with Ryan made me feel physically sick, and the last thing I wanted was to touch her. As we got ready for bed, I grabbed a pillow and told her I'd be sleeping in the guest room. I saw the hurt in her eyes, and honestly, I was glad. A part of me hoped it might make her reconsider this ridiculous plan of hers. The next morning, I woke up half expecting that everything from the night before had been a bad dream. I hoped she'd come to her senses, but when I walked into the kitchen, there she was, cheerfully making breakfast like she'd won the lottery. She had a smile plastered across her face, and when I glanced at the calendar, I noticed today's date, June 6th, circled in thick, black marker. I couldn't help but think of the irony. On this day in 1944, thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches to free Europe from tyranny. And here I was, losing my wife to another tyrant. Emily served me breakfast with a smile and said, I know you're worried, but a year from now, I'll be back, and I'll be all yours again. I just need this time to sort things out. Trust me, Mike, you won't regret it. I stared at her, my stomach churning as she continued. I called Ryan this morning while you were still asleep. He's picking me up in an hour. Each word hit me like a hammer, but I wasn't ready to give up. Emily, you don't have to do this. You still have time to change your mind. You don't know if, in a year, you'll be free from him. Don't risk throwing away our marriage for something so uncertain. We've spent nearly 30 years together. But she just smiled, as if she knew better than me. Mike, I appreciate you letting me have this time. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. Our marriage will be stronger when I come back. Now, I need to finish packing. With that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a plate of tasteless food. I forced myself to eat, even though my appetite was gone. Afterward, I went to get dressed. When I walked into our bedroom, I saw 3 large suitcases packed and ready to go. Emily smiled at me, almost like nothing had changed. I think I've got everything I need, she said sweetly. Would you mind taking these bags to the porch for Ryan? I stared at her, incredulous. No, I said firmly. Her smile faltered, and she looked at me, surprised. No, Emily. If you're so determined to throw away 30 years of marriage, then you and Ryan can carry your own bags. I won't help you make this mistake. Her eyes welled up, but instead of backing down, she snapped. He's not an idiot, Mike. Ryan is a good man, a hero who served our country. He's done more than you ever have. I turned away, muttering under my breath, yeah, he's earned his medals, while I've spent 5 days a week providing for you and our daughter. Maybe you're right. It doesn't mean anything anymore. She lugged her suitcases downstairs, one by one, giving me icy glares with each trip. It didn't take long before Ryan's car pulled up to the house. From the window, I watched him load her bags into the trunk. Emily called out to him that she'd be right there, and then she turned to me one last time. We stood in awkward silence until I finally broke it. If you're really going through with this, just remember, no contact. Not for the entire year. Her face softened, and for a moment, I thought she might change her mind. I understand, Mike, she whispered, but everything will be okay. You'll see. Remember, you promised to give me this year. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She stood there waiting for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding, but I had nothing left to give. Finally, with a quiet, I love you, she leaned in for a kiss. But I turned my head, and she ended up placing a hand on my cheek instead. I pulled away, coldly stating, I can't kiss you, knowing you're going to him. Tears filled her eyes, and before I knew it, she was out the door, running straight into Ryan's arms. I watched from the doorway as they embraced, my heart boiling with rage. 2 minutes later, the car was gone, and my driveway was as empty as my heart felt. I stood there for a while, processing the reality that my wife was no longer mine. She belonged to him now. I called in sick to work that morning, not trusting myself to function normally. Instead, I drove to the hardware store and bought new locks. I spent the entire morning changing every lock in the house and updating the alarm system. The work kept me busy, kept my mind off Emily for a few hours. But once I finished, the sadness hit me like a tidal wave. I did what most people would do in a situation like this. I unplugged the phone, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and drank until I couldn't feel anything anymore. I thought drowning myself in alcohol would ease the pain of losing Emily, but it was pointless. By Sunday morning, I was out of booze, which felt like a blessing in disguise. I was drained in every way. I fell into bed and slept deeply until I was jolted awake by knocking. Groggy, I realized it was my daughter Sarah at the door. She was shocked by the mess I was in and the stench of alcohol that filled the house. Dad, what's going on? She asked, her face full of concern. Through my pounding headache, I managed a week. What do you mean? She led me to the kitchen. You need coffee and food, then you can tell me what's happening. After an hour, with some food and coffee in me, I told her the whole story. Her mother, Ryan, the so-called break. Sarah was stunned. Wait, so Mom's taking a year off from your marriage to be with her old high school boyfriend? She asked, disbelief in her voice. I nodded. Yeah, something like that. Her questions mirrored my own. What are you going to do? I hadn't fully decided, but I found myself saying, Micro, I'll call in sick again and see a lawyer. She looked pained. I can't believe Mom would do this. Maybe she's going through something? Like a breakdown? I had no answers. I don't know, Sarahi. She stayed with me for a few hours, trying to comfort me. Before she left, I asked, why did you come by today? She paused before saying, Mom called, told me to check on you. Didn't say why or where she was. I nodded, feigning understanding. Thanks, Sarahi. Be safe driving home. The next day, I kept my word and met with a lawyer. I was right. Emily couldn't touch half my pension, though our assets were still up for debate. The following weeks passed quicker than I expected. I found a strange sense of relief in living for myself, but the loneliness gnawed at me. The hardest part was waking up and going to bed alone. I didn't hear from Emily until mid-July. That's when I saw them, Emily and Ryan, at Flynn's, a fancy bar in town. They walked in hand like love-struck teenagers, completely unaware of my presence. I watched them, noting how Ryan, muscular and decently attractive, seemed to have a controlling hold over her. She listened to him intently, hanging on his every word. When she spotted me at the bar, her smile was small and timid. After a moment's hesitation, she came over. "Hello, Mike. How are you?" I could have lashed out, but I kept it cool. "Oh, just great. My wife of 30 years ran off with some guy. What do you want, Emily?" She blinked, confused, but pressed on. "I need to get into the house. I left some personal stuff there, but my key didn't work." I smiled, still polite. "Well, Emily, it makes sense that your key doesn't work. You don't live there anymore." She just stood there, not knowing how to respond. I added, "You'd better get back to your boyfriend before he starts worrying." Her eyes filled with tears as she turned and walked away. I thought that would be the end of it, but 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand spin me around in my seat. Ryan stood there, furious. "You made my woman cry. I don't like it." My heart pounded, but I stood my ground. "You mean my wife, not your woman. You stole her, so stay out of our business. You want to hit me? Go ahead. But think about the cops when they show up." Ryan hesitated, clearly not the sharpest guy. I pressed harder. "Two choices. Hit me and go to jail, or sit your ass down and leave me alone." My heart raced, but I kept a steady gaze. Just then, the bar manager stepped in, asking if there was a problem. Ryan grumbled, "No problem," and retreated to Emily. A few minutes later, they paid and left. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the personal items Emily claimed she needed. Determined to find out, I spent hours searching the house. Eventually, I uncovered boxes beneath her bureau. Inside them were letters from Ryan to Emily, dating back years. As I read through the letters from Ryan, it became clear this affair had been brewing for years. One letter, dated 5 years ago, read, "It's comforting to know you still miss me. When I return, we'll be together. You'll have to find a way to rid yourself of your weak husband." It felt like I was flipping through a cheap novel, each letter full of his plans with Emily or reminiscing about their high school days. By the time I finished, the reality of my situation was undeniable. I didn't hear from Emily again until my birthday, September 1st. When I got home from work, I found a covered dish and a birthday card on the porch. Inside was my favorite stew and a note. "Mike, I know we're not supposed to talk, but I couldn't ignore your birthday. I dream of us every night. By the end of this year, I'll be yours and he'll be gone. Please don't stop loving me." Sarah, who'd been checking on me since Emily left, called later. After some small talk, she dropped the real reason for her call. "Dad, Mom wants to be there when my baby is born. And she wants Ryan to come too." That stopped me in my tracks. "She what? And you and James had dinner with them?" I could barely keep my anger in check. Sarah tried to calm me down. "Dad, Ryan's not that bad. He makes Mom happy. I haven't seen her this joyful in years." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Years ago, your grandmother called him names, and nothing has changed. First, you're eating with him, now you're defending him. He's tearing our family apart." My frustration spilled over. "What's next? You calling him Dad?" Sarah's voice softened. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean it like that. The damage was done, though." "It's fine, Sarahi," I said, cutting her off. "I've got something in the oven. Take care." That conversation was a turning point. I realized my life would never be the same, and it was time to act. First, I started liquidating assets to reduce what Emily might claim. Then I re-entered the world, got legal advice, bought a stun weapon for protection, booked a trip to Vegas, and even ventured into online dating, looking for someone who wanted stability like I did. It was clear that my future was now in my hands. Sarah gave birth to my first grandchild a few weeks later. I rushed to the hospital after hearing the news. As I approached Sarah's room, I overheard her talking to Emily. "Mom, what you and Dad are doing is pointless. Do you really want to lose him to Ryan?" Emily's reply was confident. "I won't lose him. His love for me is too strong. What I have with Ryan is amazing, like high school but better, now that we can be together. I'll miss it when I go back to your father." Sarah's voice was filled with disgust. "Mom, I don't want to hear about your bed life with Ryan. I want my child to have grandparents who are together, not fighting." Her words stung, and she pleaded, "Please, go back to Dad before it's too late. Ryan's great now, but Dad is always there. He'll never abandon you." But Emily didn't see it. "You don't need to worry. When I'm done with Ryan, your father will take me back with open arms." Sarah's reply was heavy with skepticism. "Mom, I've spoken to Dad. He's changing, and not in a good way. Since you left, Dad's been bitter and distant. Are you really willing to risk a 30-year marriage for your high school sweetheart?" Sarah's voice carried frustration, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden. Forcing a smile, I walked into the room. "Hey, Mom, congratulations on your new son. You must be thrilled." I hugged Sarah, completely ignoring Emily. It was petty, but it felt easier. Emily shot me a look, but Sarah beamed. "Dad, have you seen him yet?" she asked. "No, sweetie. Just wanted to check on you." Emily finally broke the tension. "Hello, Mike. How are you?" I barely looked at her, focusing on Sarah instead, asking about the birth and the baby's name. When Sarah said they were naming him Michael, after me, I felt a wave of emotion. Emily, clearly upset by the name, excused herself to see the baby. After she left, I took Sarah's hands. "Sarah, your mom and we're not going to reconcile." She looked shocked. "No, Dad. She'll come to her senses." I shook my head. "Sweetheart, I was never enough for your mother. I've decided I'll be starting divorce proceedings soon." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I told her to beg for you to take her back, but it's too late, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yes, it's too late. I can't forgive the betrayal." We sat quietly for a moment, then talked about other things. Anything but Emily and Ryan. Before I left, I promised to return the next day to spend more time with the baby. I went to the newborn ward, where I saw my grandson for the first time. He was so small, and for a moment, I felt peace. James soon approached, standing between me, Emily, and Ryan. He handed me a cigar, smiling. "Here, Dad. Smoke this to celebrate." I tucked it in my pocket and patted him on the back. "I'll save this for later." But the moment was quickly tainted by the sight of Emily and Ryan holding hands like teenagers. It made me sick. I turned to James. "I'll come back tomorrow when it's less crowded, if you catch my drift." James nodded, understanding. "I get it, Dad. I don't blame you." As I was about to leave, Emily called out softly, "Mike, doesn't it feel like just yesterday we were bringing Sarah home? And now we're grandparents. Time flies." I glanced at her, still clinging to Ryan's hand, and walked away without responding. She seemed confused as I left. October was a turning point for me. I went to Vegas with a plan: lose money to reduce our shared assets. But what really made the trip was meeting Sophia, a woman in her 50s who made me feel alive again. She told me she worked as an escort because some men prefer older women, and in my case, she was right. Sophia wasn't just skilled in bed, she was a good listener. I told her everything about Emily and Ryan, and by the end of the night, she knew me better than I knew myself. Before leaving, she caressed my face and said, "Mike, I've been with thousands of men, but I can count on one hand the ones I truly respect. You're one of them. Your wife has no idea what she's giving up. Don't let her actions change who you are." Her words stuck with me. For the first time since Emily left, I didn't miss her. I realized that I couldn't let this marriage break me. When I returned from Vegas, I told my lawyer to start drafting the divorce papers. I also decided to dig into Ryan's past, hiring a private firm to investigate him. The fees were high, but I didn't hesitate. Half of it would come from Emily's share of the assets. I felt confident that the firm would uncover the information I needed. I also began considering a transfer to another office at work, something I had never entertained before. When I brought it up with my boss, he was surprised but supportive, saying he'd look into it. As Thanksgiving approached, I knew it would be a tough holiday. Sarah called about a week before to invite me to dinner. "Dad, we'd love for you to join us," she said. But when I asked if her mother and Ryan would be there, she hesitated before confirming. That was all I needed to hear. "No, Sarah. I'm sorry, but I won't be there." A few days later, I got an unexpected call from my brother-in-law. I wasn't sure what to expect, but something told me this conversation might be different. A few days after Thanksgiving, James called my office and requested a meeting. We agreed to meet at a bar in the city center for a quiet drink. James seemed agitated, and after some initial pleasantries, I ordered us 2 double scotches. It didn't take long for James to open up about what was bothering him. "Dad, you wouldn't believe it, but they're both infatuated with him. It's all Ryan this, Ryan that. You'd think he was the guy from the beer commercial, the most interesting man in the world," James said, taking a frustrated sip of his drink. I was taken aback by his bluntness and wondered if he had come to persuade me to attend Thanksgiving. "Do I understand correctly that you don't exactly approve of Mr. Cooper?" I asked. James's face tightened with anger. "Dad, that man is arrogant, self-centered, and selfish. He's so in love with himself, I don't see how he has any room left for Emily." Realizing he had let his emotions show, James quickly apologized, but I waved it off. "No worries, son. When did you stop calling her mom and start calling her Emily?" I asked, intrigued by his change in tone. "Ever since she left you," he admitted, his face flushing with anger again. "I've lost all respect for her." "Curious," I pressed, "why did her leaving affect you so much?" James hesitated, then opened up about something I hadn't known. "I never talked about my parents because my mother cheated on my father. After they split, my father drank himself to death. I despise cheaters. Now that Emily's become one, I can't stand her anymore. I'm pretending for Sarah's sake, but I'm worried." I had never heard about James's parents, and while I felt sympathy for him, his anxiety about the situation caught my attention. "What are you worried about?" I asked. He took another deep sip of his drink before answering. "The saying, like mother, like daughter, worries me. If Emily can cheat and talk about it like it's no big deal, how long before Sarah gets tempted too?" I raised my eyebrows, understanding his concern. "I see where you're coming from," I said, taking a sip of my own drink. "But don't lose hope, James. I've got some plans for the new year, and I think things will change. I also have a few surprises in store for Christmas, though not everyone will be happy about them." For the first time that evening, James smiled, and for the next 15 minutes, he tried to pry more details out of me, but I didn't budge. As we wrapped up our meeting, I smiled again and asked, "Aren't you forgetting something, James?" "What do you mean, Dad?" he asked, confused. "You're supposed to ask me to be a big boy and come to Thanksgiving," I said with a grin. James chuckled, then asked, "So, will you come to Thanksgiving?" I shook my head. "No, but I appreciate the invite." Sarah called twice more before Thanksgiving, pleading for my attendance, but I finally put my foot down. "Look, Sarah, when your mother left in June, I made it clear there'd be no contact for a year. I already broke that rule for Michael's birth, but I won't break bread with them. Is that understood?" When the holiday arrived, I spent it alone with a frozen dinner. It was lonely and sad, but it was better than watching Emily and Ryan exchange looks over turkey. December brought the looming prospect of another family gathering, Christmas, but I knew it would be the last holiday I'd have to endure in this mess. The month, however, turned out to be eventful. First, my company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, and I accepted. Then, the private investigator I hired sent over his report on Ryan. It was revealing. Apparently, Ryan had a long history of infidelity, with 3 ex-wives who had left him for cheating. He also had children with other women, whom he paid child support for. His last wife had taken half of his pension in the divorce, and he'd been demoted in the Marines due to his behavior. In short, Ryan's life was a financial and moral disaster. The best news, though, was that Emily would receive her divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. The holiday spirit was finally starting to creep back into me. I called Sarah to discuss Christmas plans, but once again, she pleaded for a family gathering. When I asked if Ryan would be there, Sarah became frustrated. Dad, you need to accept that he's part of our family now, whether you like it or not. I cut her off. You're right. I don't like it. But for the sake of my grandson, I'll be there. Sarah was genuinely pleased. Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy. I doubted that, but I didn't want to ruin her excitement. 2 days later, when I returned home from work, the phone rang. I picked it up without thinking. Hello? There was an awkward silence on the other end before a hesitant voice finally spoke. Mike, it's me. Emily. Is something wrong, Emily? Are you hurt? I asked, unsure why she was calling. No, I'm fine, she replied, her voice soft and uncertain. I just wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I realize now how much I've hurt you. We've never spent a holiday apart in 30 years, and being without you at Thanksgiving was miserable. I've been thinking about us a lot lately. Emily's voice trembled slightly as she spoke over the phone, lacing her words with regret. It was clear she was trying to evoke some sense of nostalgia or sympathy from me, maybe hoping to rekindle something that had long since started to fade. I wasn't having it. Emily, I interrupted, my tone firm. I'm glad to hear that you're finally reflecting on what you've done, but I need to remind you of something. When you left, I insisted on no communication between us. I made an exception for Christmas Day, but I think it's best we keep things as they were. So, let's end this conversation here. Goodbye. I hung up before she could respond. As I sat there, a wave of guilt washed over me. Never in our entire 30-year marriage had I spoken to her so coldly, so harshly. The memory of her voice on the phone lingered, and for a moment, I felt awful about how I had handled the call. But as much as I hated how I'd spoken to her, it didn't compare to the hurt she'd inflicted when she left me for Ryan. The pain of that day was still as fresh as it had been months ago, and I reminded myself that her actions were the real cause of all this. The days leading up to Christmas passed slowly. I had plenty of time to shop for gifts, pack for my new job in Spokane, and wrap up my life in this town. I had already rented a car for the cross-country drive, and I'd spoken to a helpful woman at the new office who had arranged for me to see a few well-furnished apartments when I arrived. Everything was falling into place. On Christmas Day, I arrived at Sarah and James's house a little later than expected, only to find that Emily and Ryan had already made themselves comfortable. Sarah greeted me warmly, surprised to see me. Dad, I wasn't sure you'd actually come, she said, pulling me into a tight hug before rushing back to the kitchen to finish the holiday meal. James was the next to greet me, taking my coat as I asked, Can I see my grandson? Of course, Dad, James said with a smile. He's asleep in the nursery, but you can take a look. I nodded and made my way down the hall, entering the quiet room where my grandson lay in his crib. As I stood there, watching him sleep, I felt a surge of emotion. He was so small, so innocent, and I realized how much I was going to miss him. Leaving was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. Emily entered the room behind me, moving silently until she stood beside me, staring at the sleeping baby. Her presence felt wrong, almost as if the universe had shifted and put her in a place she didn't belong. After all, she should have been here from the beginning, but she had chosen a different path. We have a wonderful grandson, Mike, she whispered, her voice soft. Yes, Emily, I replied, keeping my eyes on the baby. But who will he call Grandpa? Me? Or Ryan? Or both? The bitterness in my words was unmistakable. Emily seemed taken aback. Why would you say that? You're the only grandfather this child will ever know. I turned to her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Let's hope you're right, Emily. Let's hope you're right. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in silence. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully. James and I chatted while Sarah, Emily, and Ryan remained in their own world. I could see how easily Ryan had charmed Sarah, and it pained me. She was falling for his act, just like her mother had. James, on the other hand, looked just as miserable as I felt. I hope tonight changes things, Dad, he said quietly as we stood by the fireplace, keeping our voices low. I can't stand seeing that fool around Sarah any longer. I nodded. Don't worry, James. I've got a few surprises planned for tonight. You'll get some relief soon. Dinner was served, and while the food was delicious, the company left much to be desired. Ryan, ever the storyteller, dominated the conversation with tales of his so-called bravery in the Marines, recounting exaggerated exploits while Sarah and Emily hung on his every word. James and I remained quiet, exchanging occasional glances of mutual frustration. The meal felt like an eternity, but I knew the end was near. After dinner, Sarah brought the baby into the living room, cradling him proudly as we all gathered around the tree. It was a picture-perfect scene, but I knew this might be the last time we'd all share such a moment. Sarah was radiant as she passed the baby to James and instructed him to start handing out gifts. When he did, Sarah gave me Emily and Ryan presents. Emily received a sweater, Ryan got a gift card, and I unwrapped a tie. Practical gifts, but nothing that stood out. In a way, it felt like a reflection of how Sarah and Emily saw me. Practical but uninspiring. I didn't mind, though. The real surprise was coming soon. When it was my turn, I stood up and faced the room, holding a large bag of presents. I'd like to give you all the gifts you truly deserve, I said with a calm smile. Sarah and James exchanged curious glances as I reached into the bag and pulled out a festively wrapped envelope, handing it to them. Sarah tore it open eagerly while James looked on, and within moments, her joyful scream filled the room. "Mom, Dad gave us your house. We don't have to pay a mortgage anymore," she exclaimed, jumping to her feet. Emily's face twisted in shock, her eyes darting toward me, filled with concern. "Why did you do this, Mike? Where will we live?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. I smiled, a coldness in my expression. "Don't worry, Emily. I've thought of everything." I handed her a small wrapped box. "Here, this is for you." Emily hesitated for a moment before tearing off the paper, revealing a delicate bracelet. She pulled it out and looked at it closely. "Take a look at the inscription," I said, watching her carefully. She turned the bracelet over, her face paling as she read the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Mike." "Mike, this is lovely, but you forgot to write with love," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head. "I didn't forget, Emily. I just chose not to lie." The room fell silent as I continued. "My love for you has been fading for months now. This bracelet is my farewell, a reminder of what you sacrificed for your new life with Ryan. And you'll be receiving divorce papers on Monday." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she processed the news. Emily's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. "Mike, no. Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "I tried to express my gratitude for the good years we had," I said, ignoring her plea. "There's also a check in there for half of our liquid assets, though it's not much, considering you left me in June. The house was always meant for Sarah once you walked out on our marriage." I turned toward Ryan, whose face had gone from smug to furious in a matter of seconds. "And as for you," I continued, "I have something for you too." I handed Emily another envelope. Inside is a full account of Ryan's activities since your high school days. I think you'll find it enlightening." Ryan shot to his feet, his face red with rage. "You bastard! I'll ruin you," he yelled, his hands balled into fists. Before he could move, I pulled out a stun gun and jabbed it into his side, sending him crashing to the floor, convulsing in pain. Sarah screamed, "Dad, no!" while Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. I didn't stop. I hit Ryan with 2 more shocks, just to make sure he stayed down. The sight of him writhing on the floor brought a twisted sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough to dull the ache in my chest. Turning to Emily, I spoke softly but firmly. "You think you can betray me and walk away unscathed? This is just the beginning, Emily. You may have thought your life would be exciting with him, but you'll never forget what you gave up." Emily's sobs grew louder. "Mike, please. I was going to come back to you in June. I love you." I looked at her, my heart heavy with bitterness. "No, Emily. You made your choice. Now you can live with it." I delivered one final shock to Ryan before James intervened, placing a hand on my arm. "Dad, maybe that's enough. You've made your point." I stared down at Ryan, who lay groaning on the floor, then turned back to the two women I had loved for so long. "Thanks for the memories," I said, my voice dripping with finality. "I'll be leaving now. Don't expect to see me again." As I grabbed my coat, I stopped briefly at Sarah's side, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Sarah, learn from this. If you follow your mother's path, you'll lose everything: your husband, your home, your life." I stepped toward the crib where my grandson lay, touching his soft cheek. "Goodbye, baby. Maybe we'll meet again, but I doubt it." With a final glance at the silent, stunned room, I smiled and said, "Happy New Year, everyone." Then I walked out the door, leaving behind the life I had built over 30 years. As I started my car and drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, and sadness. The weight of the past months finally began to lift as I thought about my new life in Spokane. Maybe seeing Sophia again would help me forget everything I had left behind. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw James standing on the porch, smiling and waving. I returned the gesture, grateful that at least one person understood. Then, with the future stretching out before me, I drove off into the unknown.